Reni is a freelance writer for a range of publications, including Democracy, The Independent, Guardian, Dazed and Confused, The New Humanist, and The Voice. The list goes on. She's also a regular contributor to BBC Women's Hour and contributed to the lineup of the 2014 Most Powerful Women list. Reni has also been named one of the 30 under 30 in digital media by The Guardian. So, really looking forward to this. Over to you, Reni.
Can I shut this laptop?
Can you shut it?
Yeah.
I should think so.
Yeah. I'm going to do that next. Alright, well, the first thing I should let you know, I should let you know a couple of things. One, I'm not an academic, so don't expect anything too highbrow. Two, I personally get bored of the sound of my own voice after 10 minutes of listening to it, so I think I'd much rather this be a conversation rather than me just moan and drone at you, so I can't promise you that I'm going to go on for an hour. And yeah, I think those are the two things I want to tell you before I get started, just two disclaimers. So I've been invited here today to talk about doing feminism, and I thought about it a lot. A lot of my work has received recognition for a number of reasons, but mostly because I talk about what, as academics, you'll all understand to be intersectionality. It's fair to say that I played a role in puncturing some national feminist debate around what it means to be a woman, when I pointed out that black women are people too, and that just understanding that race inequality is something that exists in feminist circles, let alone the rest of the world. And funnily enough, that drew a lot of controversy, and I wonder why. So that's really sort of what a lot of my work has been known for, but that's not the only thing that I talk about. And today I really wanted to talk about a couple of things. I wanted to talk about women on two ends of the class spectrum in terms of who we as feminists, as a movement, defend and who we don't defend. Because I think that it's actually key and crucial to analyse these situations in terms of doing feminism, because it's only by criticising a movement that it can progress and that it can get better. Because, you know, if you've always done what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. So I'm always very pro-criticism. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was a young woman who I'm not sure if any of you know of. It really depends if you read the tabloid press or not, but her name is Josie Cunningham. She's around my age. And I think about a year ago, she got a boob job on the NHS. I think this was, does anybody remember this news story? Yeah, so I think this was because of, my understanding, I looked into it. She got it because she had absolutely no breast tissue, and she was, you know, suffering some sort of emotional distress and depression, etc., etc. So the Sun newspaper found out about this and broke the story. The Sun is a newspaper that's read by about 6 million people every week. And what they did when they broke the story is that they took an unsuspecting working class white woman and essentially just threw her to the public ring. They basically threw it to the dogs. When they broke that story, I remember very clearly social media, you know, staff, common rooms, etc., etc. Everywhere where everybody was talking was awash with talk of this woman being licentious, selfish, you know, awful, model of everything that's wrong with today's society. In that same month, the Sun organised a topless shoot with her, and they set her up essentially to be a human being that was completely reviled. And I think that's a really interesting sort of example of a particularly classist kind of misogyny that's aimed at particular kinds of women. And actually, those women who are on the receiving end of that misogyny, I don't think they get a lot of defence from the feminist movement, to be honest with you. It's a particularly sort of racist and classist misogyny. The equivalent, I think, would be something in the US of what US black feminists call the construction of the welfare queen, where this is another person who's sort of like, you know, leeching off the state, leeching off the state's money because bad life choices, etc., etc. A writer who I really like, I don't even read any of her work, but her name's Reni Eddo-Lodge. She wrote about this, not this particular topic, she wrote about this ages ago, but she wrote this essay for a website that I'm involved in called Feminist Times, and it's called Child as a Feminist Issue. And in it she wrote, this sort of the word child seeks to validate removal of state support from women. It plays on stereotypes of moral decline, sexual depravity, and social disintegration, and basically says that this is what that woman's lifestyle choices are meant to represent. And I think that Josie Cunningham is a very good example of exactly this construction that Rhiannon has correctly identified. It's a class-based misogyny, and it's also coupled particularly with an attack on the welfare state, because you'll just see, Joe Bloggs' commentary on this is, this is a pointless, frivolous spend, etc., etc. This money could have been spent for X, this money could have been spent for Y. But ultimately, we're sort of encouraged to aim our invective at these unsuspecting women who some journalists with not very good intent have dug up and found, instead of aiming our rage at people who are making our material conditions worse to live in. And if anybody's been keeping an eye on the news in the last few weeks, you'll see countless examples of this. So every aspect of Josie Cunningham's life has been combed through, and actually she's got a celebrity agent now and she's coming out with a book. I'm not naive enough to say that she's being mercilessly picked on for no reason, but this is a story that the tabloid press absolutely loves. There's 57 articles about her on the Mirror's website currently, and interestingly enough, the most explosive ones have been about the fact that she, in order to earn money, has done sex work, which of course is morally reprehensible, and also she was considering an abortion. And I think these are two particularly interesting issues, because these are lightning rod issues around bodily autonomy. One which is relentlessly defended in feminism that gets the most airtime, which is often middle-class white feminism, and one that is relentlessly, relentlessly, I wouldn't say derided, but there's certainly strands of feminism that's very interested in abolishing sex work in all its forms. But both are issues about bodily autonomy. So I think that story about Josie Cunningham exists for a lot of things. It's not only just about policing women, and I could go into sort of some interesting analysis of, women's sexuality being shamed, but I'm sure you've heard that a billion times before. But it's actually, I think, even less so about that, because there's undoubtedly, in a lot of these stories about licentious, out-of-control women, there's coercion. If not with the Magaluf girl around the fact that she was promised a holiday, but also I think Josie Cunningham was coerced by journalists who saw that she was a good story, right? Ultimately, I think that these stories exist to attack progress, particularly women's progress, the fact that women have the right to have a good job if they want to, the fact that women can consider an abortion to advance their careers, the fact that we do have a welfare state that will pick you up when you're low. Another person who I think that the feminist community is slow to defend at all is Talisa from N-Dubs, who I think is a really interesting situation in that her story sort of intersects race, class and gender. And Talisa isn't black, but then there aren't a lot of women in the British public sphere who are black, who have a large amount of success. Usually what happens is they reach a certain level of success, realise the system is institutionally racist, and then leave and go to the US. So Talisa is mixed Greek and Irish. But she's very interesting in that the background that she comes from, the background that she was sort of shot to fame via, is very much, and I use this to illustrate the language of this institutional racism, is tainted with blackness. So her femininity sort of falls outside some very specific white middle class boundaries. And this is because she came from this group called N-Dubs, which I don't know if anybody's familiar with, but they're sort of like, I wouldn't even say they're a rap group, but they sort of like came off the back of the UK grime scene about 10 years ago. They were very much associated with Channel U and, you know, hoodies, you know, and this was very much, you can see this sort of like progression into Lisa's career, that A, she's moved very much far away from that, but also the commentary around her, which is heavily racist as well as class-based misogyny. This is about blackness as disease, as criminality, and as contagious. This is, you don't have to do a Google search of Talisa to see some of the language that's used to describe her, and actually a lot of it reminds me of the fact that this blackness that she was associated with was sort of like a criminality, sort of like contagious disease sort of thing. And it reminds me of after the London riots when David Starkey, everybody's favourite rich old white man, went on Newsnight and said, oh, the whites have become black. And Boris Johnson around the same time said that the riots were sort of like lifting a rock, in that, you know, that sort of language where he literally describes the people who were participating in the riots as insects and creepy crawlies and discussing things to be wild. So I think that Talisa, she's so associated with sort of like the evils of blackness and poverty that she's almost sort of like symbolic of black women in the public sphere, I suppose. And that, what actually happened, well, the reason why I've not heard from Talisa in quite some while is that she was severely punished for this. Remember, she was, you know, fairly successful. She'd been invited to go on, she was like an X Factor presenter or an X Factor John, I can't remember now. I stopped watching X Factor a while ago. But, you know, she was fairly successful. I think she even had her own fragrance and stuff. And she was punished twice. Once by the tabloid press getting hold of an old sex tape, which I think that she sort of like brushed off her shoulders superbly by saying, yes, I have sex, this person has betrayed me, rather than, oh, I'm so sorry that engaging in sex acts is so terrible because I'm supposed to be respectable and chaste now. And so that didn't really bring her down, but the second thing that really did was the Sun newspaper again, their campaign sting, where they essentially, again, sent a journalist out to, I think they sent a journalist out to a nightclub, and she sort of like recorded a conversation in which she said that she could get one of them drugs, and that obviously knocked her off her pedestal because she was a working class woman who was associated with blackness, and how dare she get so uppity. And I think she ended up getting arrested. I'm not quite sure what exactly happened, but those two women in particular, I think they really stick in my mind, for the main reason being that they sort of serve as scapegoats, essentially, and they remind the rest of us not to get too uppity, particularly, you know, if you're not middle to upper class, thin and white. If you're not Cara Delevingne, or who's another one? Who's one of these other particularly slim, white, aspirational women that we're supposed to look up to? Emma Watson is another one. Then if you're not that, you shouldn't ever try to be that, and if you are that, then you will be knocked off your pedestal. And I think it's really interesting in terms of, I don't want to say mainstream because I think that's such a tired word, but in terms of popular feminist discourse, who's being defended and who isn't. And what's clear to me is that those women aren't being defended, and I think that there's a problem with the feminism that we are doing when those women are sort of essentially thrown to the dogs and sort of like created to be national hate figures. So this really sort of leads me on to the politics of feminism, and my work is, I think it's focused extensively on the exclusivity of feminism. And, you know, I've got a lot of feedback on my work, and sometimes this feedback sort of positions me as sort of like a hater or somebody who, you know, watching from afar. But, you know, I'm fairly young, and I've been involved in feminism since my late teens, almost 5 years now. And this isn't sort of like, you know, internet commentary or sort of like watching from afar. This has been my real life experiences in feminist circles since I've started going to conferences and getting involved in activism at uni, which was a feminism that didn't really recognise that race could be conflated with power at all. That sort of, I suppose, unconsciously worked to exclude and marginalise people who didn't look like them, as well as, you know, on the surface, work towards inclusivity, but behind the scenes, sort of like actively work to ensure that nobody who wasn't deemed respectable enough would ever be able to climb to the top. And I was thinking about this in the context of some news that came out a couple of days ago, which is that Labour's Harriet Harman spoke about sexism in politics. And it made me think about how futile a lot of the exclusivity in feminism is, when the fact that those people who can succeed then go off and try and succeed in broader politics and don't succeed simply because there's still a much wider misogyny. And it made me think about the politics of solidarity and how we're stronger when we're together, and how that politics of solidarity doesn't work if it relies on some people to be silenced and dissent to be squashed, but rather that politics of solidarity can be open and honest, and that we can be critical of each other and also ourselves, and be honest with each other without sort of like receding into defence positions. So Harriet Harman, she spoke about sexism at the top of government, and in this sort of articulized reading, she gave a speech to somewhere, some sort of conference somewhere, some level conference, I don't know. And she spoke about the fact that she feels that she's been passed over as a deputy PM, and that really resonated with me for a number of reasons. Mostly that I remember that, you know, as a very recent graduate, I found myself applying for. I was very, very passionate about feminism. I found myself applying for job after job in, you know, the women's sector, and finding repeatedly that these women's sector organisations, I was being passed over for the job, but, you know, a white peer with the same qualifications was getting that, and I couldn't understand why. Harriet Harman was told that her role at the G20 summit was to basically just sit with the political wags at dinner. And I'm using political wags to sort of, I guess, illustrate the fact that their importance had been so downgraded, the wives and girlfriends of politicians. And in this speech, Harriet Harman said that the truth is that even getting to the top of these political structures is no guarantee of equality. So sometimes I wonder that what I would loosely term the respectability politics of the feminist movement, which is in order to climb right to the top, in order to be nationally recognised, you have to fit some particular agenda, even if you're not actively doing it. The people who are in control of the press, the TV producers, the journalists, are looking for a particular kind of person. Even then, even if you get all the love, even if you have all the support, you'll still face barriers. And I thought that was particularly interesting. So that sort of like conversation that she had at this event, sort of like it hit the national press, everyone's talking about, oh, you know, sexism in politics again. That conversation's been somewhat revitalised. And it prompted a response from Guardian columnist Suzanne Moore, and she basically wrote, it's time that this country had a feminist pie. I don't know if anybody's read this article. Has anybody read it? Yeah? Well, she's sort of talking about the fact that there's so much like feminist revitalisation in the UK, and has been for a few years now, and that there's vast political difference within that umbrella of feminism, and there's so much exciting energy. She says it brings her joy. She says now it's time to formally create a group that can take on the powers that be in the corridors of Parliament. And it seems to me that a feminist political party, sort of, you know, a formal political party that's jostling for seats in Parliament, really could actually be the epitome of doing feminism, right? That's a practical act of activism for material gains. But at the same time, I have some problems with it. But first, let's look at the progress of some feminist parties just this year. So, the Feminist Party already exists in Sweden. Whilst doing some shift work at Feminist Times, I edited a really interesting and exciting piece about the fact that Sweden's political party Feminist Initiative have actually gained a seat in the European Parliament. And they ran on a platform of a broadly left-wing platform that sort of ran on feminist and anti-racist politics. And I thought that was particularly interesting because they clearly weren't single issue. And I think if we were to have a feminist political party in this country, being single issue, just focusing on gender, is 100% insufficient in order to really attack structures of inequality. So I sort of wondered to myself, you know, what would a UK feminist party look like? And I suppose that needs two questions to be answered. And the first one is, what does formal politics, and I say formal because I think that almost everything is politics, but formal like government politics currently look like. And also the second question is what does the current popular UK feminist movement look like? You know, if you were a complete stranger to feminism and you just tapped in UK feminism into Google, what would come up? You know, so I thought about formal politics, and the first thing that came to my mind was hierarchy, and the fact that the highest positions are always, I'm going to say always, not even often, but always awarded to straight, white, married, cisgendered, middle to upper class men. Even though there's quite a lot of men who fit that description but are working class, they never really get to the top. I thought that was worrying, and I'm concerned for a feminist party that replicates those structures. And considering the conversations that we've had over the past 2-3 years about inclusivity and feminism, I have a big, strong fear that might continue replicating those structures. I thought about formal politics, and it reminded me of my time in student activism. I used to be a student union president just a few years ago, and I was in student politics as an independent. And that was extremely difficult because the way that the National Union of Students works is that political parties have their youth wings, and they basically suffocate all debate and work in factions, etc., etc. And I thought about the fact that so many people in those student, young Labour, I think it's Labour students, young Lib Dems, young Greens, in order to progress in that very small replication of wider party politics, they bite their tongues, dissent is quelled, and it seemed to me to be a very unhappy place. I remember meeting recently with a friend. I'm not going to say his name because this is being recorded, but he was in the young faction of one of the political parties in NUS at the time. And I recently met with him, and he said, okay, I'm working for an MP now. I'm really having some trouble with the Islamophobic rhetoric in this party. Serious trouble. And he said, but I just don't feel that I'm of the age and status in order to be able to challenge it. And personally, I don't believe in formal party politics for the reasons being that the fact is he's going to have to bite his tongue until he gets to a position in which he can challenge it, and then by the time he's in that position, he'll be discredited for challenging it. And it reminds me of, Labour MP Diane Abbott, who a couple of years ago spoke about racism and colonialism on Twitter and was called the real racist, right? So it seems to me that these formal political parties that we're speaking about aren't actually doing much in order to actively deconstruct power. And as feminists, I mean, we can have a conversation like this, but I think that's generally our aim, right? Also, in terms of formal party political politics, there isn't actually much difference in terms of the main three parties. Again, we can have a debate, but I don't see much difference. And often the principles of main political parties are actually, they're most interested in preserving power. Actually, it doesn't matter at which part of the spectrum you look at it. One might make incremental change that will, do better for the common man or woman, but actually, none of them are really actively deconstructing power, and those that aren't in Parliament and have some of their own scandals. And I think often when you look at, party formal politics or whatever you want to call it, at best, even on the left of that centre, because they all sort of sit somewhere in the centre, if they are making change, it's somewhat incremental rather than in any way revolutionary. And there's sort of like this sense that you dedicate your life to this party, but you won't see change in your lifetime. So all of those reasons, again, made me doubtful that a feminist party, in terms of actually making material gains and change for women's lives, would be any good at all. So let's talk about what popular UK feminism looks like. And I suppose I get asked about this a lot, and generally I think that feminism is actually a highly subjective ideology, actually. It's not a monolithic movement, and this is something that's very difficult to essentially put into a movement, a sort of political party structure, right? A many-headed movement with lots of different priorities is very difficult to put in a political party structure. A political party structure is going to want policy, yes, that may be debated, but there'll be policy that'll be, the priority to campaign or not to win, etc., etc. And I'm not sure that feminism as it stands in the UK actually, I don't think that would be helpful to feminism at all. Because I think that where you stand on certain issues, it sort of depends on where you sit, right? And an academic friend of my mum's told me that apparently that's called standpoint theory. So I don't think that any two women are the same. We all have particularly different backgrounds. And also that the fact that we come from different backgrounds, some of us are white, some of us are black, some of us have independent wealth, some of us are living on council estates. So we all have completely different backgrounds, and actually I think that sort of feeds into a bit of conflict in the feminist movement. This reminds me, I went to a conference. I was invited to go and speak at a conference a couple of months ago now, and this was a big open conference in London, and it had a big mixture of sort of like academics and activists and a huge packed lecture hall, and it was very exciting to see. And what actually happened was what some people might, I suppose, talk about in feminism as like infighting, which I think is a really ridiculous term to use because, again, we have different priorities and we come from often completely different ends of the political spectrum. I mean, Louise Mensch calls herself a feminist, and I don't share any politics with her at all, yet we come under the same umbrella, right? So what happened at this conference was what I would say an explosion of emotion. There was academics at the front. I was on this particular panel, and it wasn't very fun actually, because I sort of felt like I had performed the emotional labour of keeping things together. But there was an academic speaking about the fact that she feels that women, performing labour in which they, like threading your eyebrows or, pole dancing, or what I would probably call femme labour, right, which a lot of people find joy in. She's, to paraphrase, sort of said this, sort of like indulging in the patriarchy. She doesn't quite believe in the "I'm doing it for me" argument. In fact, her paper was called "I'm doing it for me." And suddenly from the audience, a shout just sort of like arose, and it was this girl who was clearly not an academic who just said, "Shut up!" She just shouted, "Shut up!" like that, and it was, wow, let me tell you, it really took loads of people aback. And she just said, "What you're saying is extremely harmful. What you're saying is marginalising a lot of people in the room. I won't stand for it anymore." And I thought that was a particularly interesting conflict because often, as women, in terms when we're not unhappy with things, we're often encouraged to internalise it. We might be encouraged to just leave the room and go and cry somewhere, but she projected her anger outwards and she just said, "Shut up, I don't want to hear you say this anymore." And it really erupted into something quite interesting. What happened was that the academic and the girl and lots of other people in the audience would just go back and forth, and that was that conflict that often is spoken about online as toxic and whatnot. That was happening in real life. For me, that was particularly interesting because often the arguments that happen online were told, "Oh, it's the internet's fault, these people aren't real, etc., etc." But these aren't arguments that are symptoms of the internet. The internet is essentially accelerating splits in feminism that already existed. And I think that it's really unhelpful to say, Twitter feminism is this, or Tumblr feminism is that, because at the end of the day, whether we were on Tumblr or whether we were all in a room together, those ideological differences still exist. I thought that was a really interesting sort of like illustration of the infighting or splits in feminism, and I think that a question I want to ask you all today is how serious do you think that is, and how do you think that we can sort of heal those rifts? Personally, my opinion is if you don't engage in eyebrow threading, perhaps it's not helpful to have an opinion on it. I think another really interesting thing that was going around on Facebook recently was a very well-known Australian beauty blogger who puts like before and after pictures of her makeup looks on Instagram. This was going around because she left a long comment because a man had commented saying, "Oh, this is witchcraft and you're deceiving men." And what she responded was really interesting, and I think it was a really good feminist response actually. She said, "Please get over yourself and get off your high horse, I'm not doing this for you." And I think that that actually typifies a lot of the sort of almost the same argument that the girl who had that outburst at that conference said, which is that actually we can engage in some things that has so traditionally been seen as for men, for ourselves. I'd like to see your opinions on that, or hear your opinions on that, because I think the choice can be an explosive word in feminism, but this conversation has to go mainstream in order for us to progress. I don't think it's 100% helpful to just stand by and look at women doing things and saying, oh, this is a symptom of this, that and the other, without actually talking to them about it, right? So, the fact that feminism is such a highly subjective ideology and that it's not a monolithic movement, I think sort of feeds into the fact that in many ways, I think for many of us, being a woman is only part of our identity, and we can recognise the fact that we experience gender-based oppression because we are women. But lots of women, we have many different identities. It's not black and white. It's not. I really disagree with the feminist analysis that says male violence is bad and women are victims, because it's 100% more, well, I suppose, intersectional than that, right? I mean, some women are white. Those women experience white privilege. I'm a person who is not disabled. I can board and alight public transport very easily. My experience is very different from a white woman who is disabled, right? And that has to be acknowledged. I can also inflict harmful oppression on people in which I'm privileged. I wouldn't say over from, but I benefit from structural privilege in a way that people who I even went to school with and didn't go to university do, right? I have a degree of education and I have to declare that, right? And I think that that's something that's particularly interesting in terms of feminism, and that's another conversation that in order for us to do feminism better, we have to have that conversation honestly and not retreat to defence. I wanted to talk about a couple of sticking points that I've just seen over the past couple of days in feminist conversations, which I don't really get involved in the online debates anymore. I just watch, mostly because I don't know if I even feel strongly enough to participate. But one has been that a national women's charity has been pulled out for the fact that their hiring policies have been perceived as transphobic by a number of trans women, in that the hiring policy essentially says that unless you have a changed name birth certificate, you'll be less likely to get hired. But I'm not going to name them because you can just do a little Google if you wish. And I think that's a really particularly interesting issue in terms of the unending argument in feminism as to what exactly is gender. There's been splits in feminism because people who largely agree about a number of different things. Some say, well, this is, a completely sensible sort of policy to have because, these women's abusers could trick the staff of the place and sneak in by saying, well, actually, I'm a trans woman, I just, haven't transitioned yet, which I think is highly problematic, actually. And then other people are saying, well, actually, this feeds into very traditional and conservative stereotypes about trans women, of people tricking, people deceiving. Another split, another sort of like lightning rod split conversation in feminism is actually about sex work, and some feminists believe that abolishing what they call prostitution, which actually I think is an extremely stigmatising word, is one of the ways that we can end gender inequality. Whereas other feminists believe that actually this is not so much about abolishing an industry, because even if something is criminalised, it will just go underground and become even more unsafe, but actually securing workers' rights in a maligned industry where people are more vulnerable to rape, assault and murder because the work that they do is extremely maligned. And actually, I'm just going to go off on a tangent here, and the Voice newspaper that I write for wrote an extremely interesting article yesterday. The content was horrific, I won't lie. It was about the rape and robbery of some sex workers. But the language that they used, which was not stigmatising, and instead used it basically used the language of that sex workers' rights activists have been pushing for the past 20 years. Instead of creating a sort of Daily Mail style, well, these women deserved it, it actually had comments underneath it calling the perpetrators scum. And I thought that was particularly interesting. So in terms of this feminist party, all of these things sort of need to be taken into account, right? it's really exciting and great that feminism is thriving, and you know, it's a healthy, big movement, and star speakers can turn up and pack out lecture halls, and everybody's buying books, and everybody's getting book deals, and everything seems to be really exciting. But there are still some issues in feminism that need to be ironed out, and I think that's because we have different priorities, and I think those different priorities come from where we stand. That really 100% depends on where we sit. And I think that those different concerns and different priorities are actually, there's often split by lines of privilege, right? We can't lie to ourselves about that. So some of the sort of priorities I'm going to raise now, I suppose we can have conversations about who do you think is going to be more likely to be concerned about this issue, who's going to be less likely to be concerned about this issue. So for example, media representation of women. I personally think that you have to be somebody who is, I guess, living a fairly comfortable life to only be solely concerned with the media representation of women. And when I talk about privilege, I'm talking about structural privilege. I'm not talking about people who have never faced hardship in their life. I'm talking about people who, you know, will turn up to the job interview table and be much more likely to get to the job just simply because their identities are perceived as more valuable than others, right? And that is informed by institutional oppression, just so we don't have this argument afterwards. Another conversation, another priority is, you know, women on boards. What kind of person is going to be more interested in having, you know, women CEOs, even women politicians, women prime ministers, women on boards? These are women who are already at quite high up levels in their careers. You know, can it really be said that having more women on the board of an international corporation is going to make life materially better for women who are a lot less well off? I'm not so sure. I think another interesting sort of like, I wouldn't say that this more as a priority of feminism, but this is more a packaging of feminism, and this has come up in recent years, and it's why we're probably called lifestyle feminism. Feminism is a lifestyle choice. This is the feminism that sells in broadsheets and newspapers and magazines, right? You know, light articles about shaving your legs, about body hair, etc., etc. These priorities, you know, in this particular feminism, I think is going to be more interested to people, you know, between the ages of 16 and 24. You know, these aren't going to be the interests of people, you know, who have kids. These aren't going to be the interests of people who are about to get sacked from their job because they're considering having kids, right? And I think that that's another really interesting sort of like debate that we need to have in feminism. If we are to have this hypothetical political party, are we going to take what we, you know, when you type in feminism in Google and go to the news tab and you see all the articles coming up about, you know, is it feminist to wear this, is it feminist to shave your legs, etc., etc. Are those the issues that we're going to tackle? No, I really don't know. Intersectional feminism, another thing that almost has sprung up as a reaction to what I've just mentioned, which I think actually is certainly the basis of my work, but when it's not, I suppose, grounded in the material conditions of women, can be a little bit abstract to people. So, you know, it's, again, are those priorities, I suppose what I'm trying to say is, you know, how are they illustrated and exactly who do they relate to? And another thing that I think is really interesting to sort of, I suppose, not pit against, but compare to intersectional feminism is what I would call white guilt feminism, which is where you get women in this country worrying very much about women in the other country, by often that country is poorer and it's blacker, and that feminist activism in the richer country doesn't take into account any of the feminist organising happening in the poor country. Is this something that our feminist party might, you know, consider a priority? I know that, I think it's, you know, after the End Sexual Violence Against Women in War conference, Emma Watson has been made some sort of special high-up person at the UN, which seems to me to be the epitome of white guilt feminism. I wonder when we have a government that's sort of like engaging in white guilt feminism ultimately, it seems a bit like a bait and switch tactic to ignore the material conditions of the policies that are sort of impacting women here. And not to say that, you know, the issue isn't extremely important, but it does require a fair bit of like holier than thou, we must save X people sort of politics, which I'm very highly uncomfortable being somebody who has heritage in some of these countries. Issues that are priorities to some women but aren't seen as feminist priorities to other women. Stop and search, which I think is actually an extremely pertinent issue for women who live in black communities who are seeing their sons particularly being harassed on a daily basis. I know this because I've got an 18-year-old mixed brother who's constantly getting stop and search, and is actually starting to develop a real fuck the police sort of like attitude, which, you know, I would consider to be a feminist priority. I think that women who have family members who are being harassed by the police on a daily basis would want this to be a priority. But if we had our hypothetical feminist party, would that even, you know, hit the priority ballot? Public sector pay and strikes. Today, public sector workers are striking across the country. The majority of those people are women, because the majority of people in the public sector are women. Would that be something that would be considered a feminist priority? I mean, it's not explicitly feminist. In fact, actually today, my friend Lola wrote something in The Guardian today speaking about the fact that women are striking for feminist reasons. Those reasons being that public sector cuts affect women's pay, public sector cuts affect the material conditions of many women's lives. Austerity, is that seen as a feminist issue? If you look through the pages of lifestyle feminism in your local broadsheet, I don't think it would be, actually. The fact that women are hit hardest, and actually not just women, but all people who already suffer from existing oppression, it gets worse for them in recessions, right? So I suppose I'll talk about I'm going to just wrap up now because I want time to chat, and I've been going on for absolutely ages with what I think I would like, if there was a feminist party, some of its priorities to be. I think that reproductive rights is a hot button issue because actually in the immediate vicinity of the UK we have a country where women are still stripped of their reproductive rights, that's Northern Ireland. And actually the UK, not just feminist movement, but those feminists identified in Parliament are not fighting for those women. My local MP, who I won't name, is a feminist identified MP, yet where's the agitation for women just a short plane ride away who still can't access reproductive rights? And another feminist priority that I think would be incredible if it, you know, reached the top of the feminist ballot would be gendered labour, gendered care, gendered domestic labour. You know, I'd love to see a resurrection of the wages for housework campaign. Right? I think that's something that so many women are doing without questioning. So while you're seeing, you know, lifestyle feminism and media representation seen as sort of like priorities, public representation of women, in the public sphere, actually, in the private sphere, women are toiling away, literally doing so much unpaid, undervalued work for no money at all, actually stopping women from being able to do other stuff, right? I think that would be incredible if our hypothetical feminist party focused on that. And actually I saw an incredible Facebook status the other day from another feminist writer. I told Charmaine about it at lunch, and she said she had some sort of job interview to go off to, and she said, "Oh, nobody told me that I needed to sort out a shirt this morning. I need a wife or an intern to you know, do unpaid work for me and basically just clean up after me, and then I'll be doing just fine." And actually, she really typified that gendered labour, right? That so many women are still expected to do without even questioning. And I think that our feminist party should challenge that, right? So, in terms of some inclusive priorities, in terms of doing feminism, I would suppose I'd say what I'd like to see is some starting from the bottom up, right? So I would like to scrap the idea of women on boards feminist campaigns, just scrap it. I would love to see the people who are putting all their time and energy and money, because there's a hell of a lot of money in that campaigning, putting that campaigning in wages for housework. In fact, not just supporting it, but taking the money they're using to campaign on women on boards and creating pay, right, for unpaid carers and unpaid people who are doing unpaid emotional labour, people who are constantly keeping houses tidy for families who just think it happens, you know, by the elves, right? I think that actually in order to have a comprehensive understanding of inequality and how it really intersects with many different oppressions in women's lives, sometimes I wonder if feminism even is the right word, because it prioritises gender in a way that other oppressions are sort of tapped on. And I suppose, you know, to sort of go back to the beginning of my talk, it's about who is front and centre of our activism, who are we fighting for. I think that having a reflection of myself in the media is somewhat important, and seeing, you know, Lupita Nyong'o succeed is great, but I sometimes wonder, is it going to change the material conditions of anybody's lives? It will help some young black girls feel prettier, because blackness is so often equated with ugliness when we're considering femininity. I think that sometimes you know, this feminist party that I'm sort of hypothetically thinking about, would actually direct action just be more effective? Would that get some shorter, quicker gains that would immediately help people's lives? And I suppose to wrap up, I suppose, what are the issues do you think would gain the biggest number of wins for the widest number of women, instead of the small wins? No, not even small wins, but big wins for a small, narrow number of women. And I suppose that the Feminist Party would, you know, would have to have a new way of operating. I don't think that it would work particularly well, particularly when you look at current debates in former political parties' hierarchical structure. I think that having leaders would not be very helpful at all. And that is typified in the fact that when you look at the feminist movement now, there aren't particular leaders. There are people who speak for themselves, but there aren't, you know, movement leaders. And spokespeople, I think, is not entirely helpful. So to wrap up, I think it'd be really interesting to sort of hear some of your thoughts in terms of priorities of feminism. Thanks for listening to me.
Thanks for that. It was great listening to your voice, so thanks. So I guess we can open the floor to some questions now. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say, if you start this feminist party, then I will vote for you.
That's kind.
Yeah, I was at that was where we met at the Goldsmiths conference that you were talking about. So I'm just really interested to hear your reflections on that, because it was such a wild experience, you know. But yeah, what are your thoughts on these kind of polarising debates? Because it seems, you know, there was some really good stuff. I think you were quite right that it was great that that kind of angle was able to be spoken. We were able to have that discussion. But to some extent, it also got quite closed down. There were quite a lot of voices that were wanting to say, you know, this is infighting, this is fragmenting. You know, we shouldn't be doing this. We should be the sisterhood. Was a word we had quite a bit. You know, what are your thoughts about how we manage those kind of conversations?
I always think that challenging the problem is not the problem is a problem. Does that make any sense? So, like, I saw Kimberly Crenshaw speak at LSE a few months back now, and she said, in terms of racism and feminist circle, she said, what happens is that the person who says there's racism here is malign rather than the racism itself, right? So, I think it's very useful to challenge stuff and provoke people to think. So I think that challenging politics that can be quite marginalising and exclusive isn't a bad thing, because isn't that what feminism is for, right? Often though we aim at the patriarchy, but it's stupid to think that we just exist out of oppressive structures, and that because we're working for liberation and equality, we can't be guilty of it ourselves. So I think that it's always better to air it, because, well, to be honest with you, either way, if you air it or if you don't, resentment will breed, right? So, and just quelling dissent and sweeping it under the carpet, it isn't healthy. That's my thoughts on the matter. I think that it's important that people work on their own priorities whilst trying to form solidarity connections with other people. And I think that we're at that first stage of that. That's what I think.
I really enjoyed you talking. I wanted to ask you two things. One is, what's your opinion of the situation with Angelina Jolie, and particularly in relation to the fact that she's been massively campaigning and getting involved in big business politics, and then finds herself on the front of a very nasty newspaper covering what is alleged to be drug stuff. I did start making a list of the ideas that, you know, in terms of the things that I would like to vote for. And some of them include free childcare, free contraception, free education, free trade training, back to housing benefit, and benefits for people who have disabilities and who aren't working to be accessible. So I guess starting at my bottom, where my people are, those are the kind of things that I think would help lots. So if I was going to set up a feminist party, that's the kind of things I'd be asking for, particularly access to just like what benefits Britain is taking apart. You know, the programme benefits Britain when they're just putting women up and saying that.
It's highly gendered, isn't it?
Yeah, it's then that, you know, they're just typifying this woman as a scrounger and she's dreadful and she's awful. So to undermine all of that, really, that's what I'd like to get working on.
Yeah, definitely, and I think that those would be things that would have the widest amount of gains for the widest amount of women.
Yeah.
And in terms of the Angelina Jolie thing, I think that's particularly interesting because that attack isn't caste, but it is about taking down somebody who has just had a wide amount of press coverage. And even though it's what I would probably consider to be white guilt feminism, I still, you know, I somewhat admire Angelina Jolie for taking on an issue that she didn't need to. She could just be rich and continue with her life. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah, I think it's quite ugly. And what's interesting is that it's an attack on a woman in the public sphere who has been more than respectable. She has been somebody we should all be aspired to. So I suppose no one's safe, but it is an exception to the trend of taking down working class women. So.
Yeah, but it's a way of getting, even the best people have managed to get down.
Yeah.
You know, even the best attempts at being okay have managed to pull down to the floor.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've got 2 minutes before 1:30, and maybe one more question.
But it's not really a question, more of a, maybe, I really enjoyed what you said about maybe we could all stop judging each other. You know, if some people want to do eyebrow threading, we should, and we don't approve of that, we should keep our pie holes shut. And I'd be very much in favour of a feminist campaign that does that, really, and that counts for everything. Why can't we all have different priorities and work on those with the people who also want to work on them, whether it's threading or the right to have an abortion if you want one and not be left to bleed to death.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, whatever's important to you is important to you, so thank you for saying that.
But I think what's interesting is that, like, I think that we should challenge campaigning that feeds into existing oppression. But I would be against it that, for example, a feminist campaign that talks about, you know, Asian grooming gangs, when that is certainly, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but the media coverage of it has been highly racialised, when the fact that Jimmy Savile, Rolf Harris and all these people, like, they've not been constructed as a white grooming gang, right? So, like, if there was a campaign about that, I'd have to step back and say, I feel like this is informed by some current, some existing racial prejudices, right? So I think it's important to challenge, you know, activism and campaigning on work that feeds into current oppressions, but I think that's important to challenge. However, I think it's also important that people have the different priorities and see how they all feed into each other. But I have big problems with feminist discourse that challenges women for sort of like self-objectification. Like, I just don't feel like that is a way to challenge power, right? And that sort of eyebrow-threading conversation is one of them. That's your self-objectifying, right? And honestly, I don't think that's a way to build any solidarity at all. So.
Can I add another one to my list? But that was reform of the criminal justice system. Why children and young people and our sons and grandsons and lots of other people are being criminalised and sent to prison.
Yeah,
and dying therein.
Yeah.
So that's another one on the list.
Okay, let's talk party now.
Okay, so
First meeting of feminist.
I speak for everyone when I say that was great.